A world built on loyalty and lies has always stood at the heart of the mafia's power, a shadow empire where rules are written not in ink but in blood, memory, and whispered promises. It is within this treacherous landscape that Lucky Luciano emerged, not just as a strategist of crime but as an architect of trust in a world where trust itself was a weapon. To understand his rise, you must first understand the paradox he lived by. Everyone was necessary, yet no one was safe. Loyalty elevated men, but it also blinded them, and Luciano learned early that survival meant mastering both its strength and its fragility. Born Salvatore Lucania, he stepped into New York's harsh immigrant streets where alliances formed quickly and dissolved just as fast. Here, young Luciano recognized that loyalty was never given freely. It had to be earned, tested, and shaped. He observed the weak cling to promises they couldn't keep and the strong betray to secure their next breath. These early lessons carved into him a belief that loyalty was neither moral nor emotional. It was strategic. He learned to study people, to watch how they behaved when threatened, when tempted, when desperate. From petty street gangs to rising criminal syndicates, he saw the same truth. A man's loyalty was only as real as the power that protected it. As he climbed through the underworld's ranks, Luciano began assembling a network of allies who mirrored his ambition. But he was never fooled by charm, reputation, or bravado. He understood that in a world built on lies, the only reliable measure of a person was how they acted when pressure tightened around them. Men like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel earned his trust not because they were flawless, but because they were predictable. Luciano valued consistency more than vows, and he quietly noted which men stayed calm in chaos and which ones cracked when money or blood was on the line. His ability to read these patterns became his greatest weapon. Yet loyalty, as Luciano knew, could also become a trap. The old mafia families clung to outdated codes that demanded blind obedience and rigid hierarchy. To Luciano, these traditions suffocated progress and invited betrayal. He saw how old-world bosses trusted the wrong people simply because tradition told them to. Instead, Luciano forged a modern vision, one where loyalty flowed upward and downward, built on mutual benefit rather than fear alone. Still, the danger never disappeared. Every alliance he made held the seed of potential betrayal, and he accepted this as the cost of power. This brings us to the central question. How did Lucky Luciano learn to trust in a world where betrayal was guaranteed? The answer lies in his understanding that trust was never absolute. For Luciano, trust was a calculation, a shifting scale measured against risk and reward. He never expected unwavering devotion. Instead, he expected behavior that made sense based on the incentives he created. If loyalty wavered, he adjusted the balance, through reward, punishment, or removal. In his world, betrayal was not shocking. It was inevitable, and preparedness was the only shield. By the time he rose to reshape the American mafia, Luciano had turned loyalty into a science. He built a structure where no single man held unchecked power, where betrayal became difficult and cooperation became profitable. And yet, even at the height of his influence, he never allowed himself the luxury of true trust. He understood that in the underworld's dark ecosystem, loyalty was a currency that could inflate, collapse, or vanish overnight. His genius was not in believing loyalty existed, but in knowing exactly how fragile it was. Stepping deeper into his world reveals how Luciano mastered the silent language of power. He read people like maps, charting routes through danger with a strategist's patience. In the mafia, strength alone meant little, perception defined survival. Luciano anticipated betrayal long before it surfaced, shaping decisions that kept him ahead of rivals and allies alike. His rise shows that loyalty was never a fixed truth but a shifting negotiation, managed through incentives and consequences. He built his empire by trusting selectively, measuring every man's motives with cold precision. Each alliance became a calculated risk, each setback a lesson carved into his memory. In tracing his beginnings, we uncover the foundation of a legacy forged through balance, between loyalty's promise and deception's inevitability. Ultimately, his intuition became the compass that guided him through an unforgiving criminal landscape and beyond. Early 20th century New York was a city boiling over with violence, ambition, and desperation, a fractured world where immigrant identities collided and rival criminal cultures battled fiercely for dominance. Long before loyalty had a measurable price, survival depended on instinct, adaptability, and the willingness to navigate a battlefield shaped by centuries-old grudges and the temptations of a rapidly modernizing America. For Sicilian immigrants, Jewish newcomers, and Irish laborers, the streets did not simply offer opportunity, they demanded allegiance, resilience, and an acceptance of bloodshed as part of daily life. These communities carried their histories with them, shaping the brutal ecosystem that would later define Lucky Luciano's rise. Sicilian crime families formed the first recognizable structure of underworld life, transporting their old codes, vendettas and hierarchical values into crowded tenements. Their loyalty was rigid, grounded in traditions that treated betrayal as unforgivable and honor as sacred. But these traditions often clashed with the chaotic realities of New York, where survival required flexibility and quick decision-making. The Sicilian bosses held tightly to old-world customs, believing that power came from fear, silence and absolute obedience. Yet the city around them was changing faster than they could control, and this stubbornness increasingly left them vulnerable. Contrasting their rigidity were the Jewish gangs, fueled by sharp intellect, resourcefulness, and the harsh lessons of immigrant poverty. These groups excelled through adaptability rather than tradition, embracing the changing landscape with strategies that confused their more conservative rivals. Young Jewish criminals, many from Brooklyn's Brownsville neighborhood, relied less on ritual and more on innovation, using whatever tactics ensured profit and security. Their alliances formed rapidly, driven by mutual need rather than cultural obligation. This flexible mindset made them unpredictable, dangerous, and capable of reshaping the rules of street warfare. Meanwhile, the Irish mobs controlled many of the city's political channels, blending brute force with backroom influence. Their dominance over labor unions, docks, and police networks gave them a unique edge, allowing them to operate boldly despite constant conflict. Unlike the Sicilians, the Irish mobsters did not depend on secrecy. Unlike the Jewish gangs, they did not rely solely on strategy. Their power came from visibility, intimidation, and their ability to infiltrate the city's institutions. This blend of legitimacy and corruption made them formidable adversaries, often serving as the first major obstacle for any rival hoping to rise. Then came Prohibition, an era that detonated the underworld and transformed disorganized crime into a full-scale empire. With alcohol outlawed and public demand higher than ever, New York became a frenzy of smuggling routes, hidden breweries, and violent turf wars. The old boundaries between ethnic groups blurred as criminals realized liquor profits were too massive to hoard. Suddenly, the Sicilian codes, Jewish adaptability, and Irish influence were thrust into direct competition, each group desperate to secure their place in a market worth millions. Violence spiked as alliances shifted weakly, and loyalty became less a matter of tradition and more a matter of utility. For young gangsters like Luciano, the city became an education in chaos. He watched the old Sicilian bosses struggle to understand the new criminal world, clinging to rules that no longer protected them. At the same time, he observed how Jewish gangs forged alliances across neighborhoods, their willingness to collaborate giving them access to opportunities traditionalists rejected. Luciano recognized that power would not come from choosing one identity over another, but from learning how each group operated, and discovering how to navigate between them. The streets taught him that alliances were not luxuries, they were lifelines. A man without allies was a man without protection, and in a world where bullets settled arguments faster than words, protection determined longevity. Luciano learned early that strength did not lie in loyalty alone but in selecting the right people to depend on. He saw how impulsive alliances collapsed under pressure and how thoughtful partnerships created stability even in dangerous conditions. The chaos around him became a classroom where every mistake, his or someone else's, offered a lesson in survival. Ethnic divisions fueled much of the violence, but they also provided a strange sense of predictability. Each group fought according to its own logic. Sicilians followed honor, Jews followed strategy, and Irish mobs followed influence. Understanding these patterns allowed Luciano to anticipate conflicts before they erupted. But even more importantly, he understood the limits of each system. Tradition restricted Sicilians, adaptability made Jewish gangs unpredictable even to themselves, and political entanglements forced Irish mobsters into unwanted visibility. Luciano saw cracks in every foundation, cracks he could exploit. This era's brutality cannot be overstated. Shootings erupted in daylight, bodies vanished into alleyways, and revenge killings became weekly rituals. Yet beneath this violence lay a formula, a way of rising through the ranks if one possessed the insight to analyze the chaos. Luciano's brilliance lay in recognizing that crime in America was no longer defined by ancient customs but by opportunity. The men who thrived were those who could evolve, negotiate, and align themselves with the forces shaping the city's underworld. By the time Luciano began forming his earliest serious alliances, the foundations of modern organized crime were already being poured. The old world and the new world existed side by side, clashing and cooperating in equal measure. From these contradictions emerged a new kind of criminal landscape, one that rewarded innovation over obedience and intellect over blind loyalty. In this crucible of violence, Luciano found not only danger but possibility. And it was here, amid the feuds, factions, and shifting allegiances of early American crime, that he forged the understanding that would later redefine the mafia itself. In the crowded streets of the Lower East Side, young Salvatore Lucania began the long transformation from an immigrant boy into the figure the world would one day call Lucky Luciano. The neighborhood was a maze of noise, hunger, and ambition, a place where every block taught a lesson and every lesson carried a price. Children grew up quickly here, learning that survival depended not simply on strength but on understanding the intentions of those around them. For Luciano, these streets were more than a backdrop. They were the training ground that shaped his instincts, sharpened his perception, and revealed the difference between allies and predators. From the moment he stepped into the neighborhood's chaotic rhythm, he realized that trust was a luxury no one could afford blindly. Street fights erupted over territory, insults, and misunderstandings that escalated without warning. Luciano found himself targeted often, especially because of his immigrant background and small stature. Bullies saw him as an easy mark, but each confrontation carved new insight into him. He studied how attackers moved, how their eyes telegraphed their intentions, and how fear or pride pushed them into reckless decisions. These observations taught him that reading people mattered as much as defending himself. Luciano's earliest encounters with violence were not heroic exchanges but messy, uneven fights in alleys and schoolyards. Yet each clash revealed a pattern. People acted according to their insecurities, desires, and hidden fears. He learned that some boys bluffed strength they did not possess, while others hid dangerous resolve behind quiet demeanors. This awareness became the foundation of his power long before he earned a reputation in the underworld. Hustling was another education. The Lower East Side buzzed with opportunity for anyone willing to bend rules, and Luciano quickly realized that hustles were less about crime and more about understanding human nature. He sold newspapers, ran errands, delivered goods, and occasionally skirted legality to earn extra pennies. Each small job exposed him to new personalities: merchants who cheated children, workers who tipped generously, gamblers who lied with a smile, and neighbors who promised help but vanished when needed. In every interaction, Luciano refined his ability to detect sincerity, deception, and self-interest. One of the most important relationships of his youth formed not through conflict but through a moment of unexpected recognition. Meyer Lansky, a quiet, sharp-minded Jewish boy, crossed paths with Luciano during a street scuffle. Luciano witnessed Lansky refuse to back down from a much larger bully, not out of bravado but out of calculated composure. He saw something rare: a boy who understood that fear could be managed and strength could be controlled. Lansky, in turn, recognized in Luciano a toughness that was more strategic than impulsive. Their friendship became one of the most influential alliances in American criminal history. What bound them was not ethnicity or shared struggle, but respect for each other's intelligence. They shared a natural ability to read situations and people with clarity uncommon in boys their age. While other children fought for pride alone, Luciano and Lansky fought with purpose. They discussed the behaviors of rivals, interpreted motives behind attacks, and predicted reactions with uncanny accuracy. In this bond, Luciano discovered the value of loyalty built on mutual understanding rather than tradition or force. Street life offered endless lessons. Luciano noticed that those who bragged the loudest usually hid insecurity, while the quiet ones often commanded more genuine respect. He learned that generosity could be a weapon, earning loyalty faster than intimidation. He saw how gossip shaped reputations, how alliances formed over shared enemies, and how betrayal often came from those who talked of honor the most. Every observation became another tool in his growing arsenal. As he grew older, Luciano expanded his operations, dabbling in petty theft, protection rackets, and small-time gambling. Each venture introduced him to people whose ambitions clashed or aligned with his own. Here he refined the art of choosing who to trust. He looked for individuals who acted consistently under pressure, who followed through on promises, and who understood risk. He avoided those ruled by emotion, greed, or fear, recognizing that such traits led to unpredictable behavior. The Lower East Side hardened him, but it also enlightened him. He began to see the underworld not as chaos but as a system governed by patterns. Power went to those who could anticipate threats and opportunities before others noticed them. Luciano trained himself to watch, listen, and measure motivations carefully. The more he understood people, the more control he gained over his surroundings. This control eventually became influence, and influence became authority. The lessons of his youth did not merely prepare him for crime, they prepared him for leadership. Luciano realized that leadership required more than issuing commands. It required understanding what drove men to obey, what scared them into silence, and what pushed them to betray. These insights became the pillars of his future empire. He knew that fear created temporary loyalty, while respect created lasting allegiance. Yet he also understood that no loyalty was permanent without continual reinforcement. In the closing chapters of his youth, Luciano stood at the threshold of a new identity. No longer just Salvatore Lucania, bullied immigrant boy, he had become a young strategist shaped by hardship. His reputation grew not from brute force but from his uncanny ability to judge character quickly and accurately. People followed him because he understood them, sometimes better than they understood themselves. Looking back, it is clear that the Lower East Side forged the instincts that would one day make Luciano one of the most influential figures in organized crime. The noise, the violence, the diversity, the hunger, and the constant negotiation of power taught him that every person carried a story, and every story revealed leverage. What he saw in the eyes of bullies, merchants, hustlers, and friends became the map he later used to navigate the far more dangerous world of the mafia. These childhood lessons, earned through bruises, bargains, and broken trust, were the true beginning of his rise. Lucky Luciano did not rise through the ranks of American crime by accident or brute strength alone. His ascent was engineered through a series of dangerous, carefully measured alliances that blended intelligence, violence, and profit into a new kind of underworld structure. While old-world mafia bosses clung to tradition and bloodline, Luciano embraced strategy and innovation. He understood early that no single man, no matter how feared, could dominate New York's criminal landscape alone. Power required partners. Partners who brought skills he didn't have, but who depended on him enough to never threaten his position. The first major pillar in his rise was Meyer Lansky. Their childhood bond had grown into a strategic partnership built on respect rather than ethnicity or tradition. Lansky possessed something rare in the underworld, a calm, calculating mind that treated crime not as chaos but as a business. He understood money in ways few gangsters ever could. While others gambled recklessly, Lansky studied odds, controlled risk, and turned uncertainty into predictable income. Luciano admired this. He realized Lansky's ability to manage finances could transform street-level hustling into a stable, scalable operation. Together, they entered the bootlegging business with a level of organization competitors could not match. Lansky handled the accounting, ensuring every shipment, payoff, and risk was calculated with precision. Luciano handled diplomacy, managing suppliers, negotiating territory, and smoothing conflicts before they grew into wars. Their partnership introduced a new style of leadership. Rule through logic and profit, not outdated codes. For Luciano, Lansky became more than a friend. He became the financial brain of an empire still in its infancy. Intelligence alone, however, could not survive the brutality of prohibition. That role fell to Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, Lansky's fiery and fearless ally. Siegel was the kind of man who could turn intimidation into an art form. He moved fast, struck hard, and never hesitated when violence was required. His temper was unpredictable, but his loyalty to Luciano and Lansky never wavered. Luciano saw in Siegel the perfect counterbalance to Lansky's calm, muscle backed by unwavering allegiance. Siegel enforced protection routes, silenced threats, and ensured that no rival dared disrupt their operations. Luciano valued his aggression but also recognized the danger of giving a man like Siegel too much power. So he crafted roles carefully. Siegel had influence but never independence. Luciano allowed him to act, but always under a structure that kept him necessary, not dominant. This balance became Luciano's signature style: give allies enough to stay loyal, but never enough to become competitors. With intelligence and muscle secured, Luciano expanded into large-scale bootlegging. He forged alliances with smugglers transporting liquor from Canada, rum runners coming up the Atlantic coast, and distillers producing product in hidden warehouses. These alliances were transactional, built on profit rather than brotherhood. Bootleggers needed protection and customers. Luciano needed reliable supply. In many ways, these relationships taught him more about power than the street ever had. He learned that people stayed loyal when loyalty was profitable, and betrayed when betrayal paid better. To maintain stability, Luciano introduced a system of shared benefits. Partners received steady income, safe routes, and guaranteed distribution, advantages few other mobs could offer. But Luciano ensured that no partner controlled an essential piece of the operation alone. If one man handled transportation, another controlled storage. If one supplied alcohol, another managed smuggling boats. Luciano positioned himself as the only person who connected every piece. In doing so, he became indispensable. His approach contrasted sharply with aging mafia leaders, who resisted alliances outside their ethnic group. They believed Sicilians should work only with Sicilians, and loyalty should be inherited, not earned. Luciano saw the flaw in this thinking. Money had no ethnicity. Profit had no tradition. The future belonged to those who adapted. His willingness to collaborate with Jews, Irish, and independent bootleggers created opportunities the old guard couldn't access. But these alliances also brought danger. Every deal risked defending powerful men who believed Luciano was breaking sacred rules. He was challenged, questioned, and sometimes threatened by traditional bosses who feared his rapid rise. To survive, Luciano refined the art of balancing fear and respect. He learned to intimidate without humiliating, to reward without empowering too deeply, and to punish without creating enemies who would return for revenge. He developed a skill for reading ambition, identifying exactly how much money or influence a man needed to feel satisfied, and stopping before that desire turned dangerous. If someone grew too bold, Luciano quietly reduced their influence. If someone showed promise, he elevated them just enough to keep them committed. His leadership style became a delicate equation of reward and restraint. This period also revealed Luciano's talent for negotiation. When rival gangs clashed over smuggling routes, he positioned himself as the mediator, offering solutions that benefited everyone while subtly increasing his own influence. When conflicts erupted within his circle, he settled them with precision, sometimes with persuasion, sometimes with Siegel's gun, but always with a clear message: order served profit and profit served all. By the later years of Prohibition, Luciano's network had evolved into something far more organized than a street crew. It resembled a corporation with specialists, divisions, and shared interests. Lansky managed finances and strategy. Siegel enforced loyalty and order. Bootleggers, dealers, and transporters formed the operating branches beneath them. Luciano sat at the center, the only man who understood every moving part. These early alliances were the foundation of the national syndicate Luciano would later build. They taught him that fear alone produced rebellion, while respect alone produced complacency. The true formula was balance, a structure where every man gained enough to stay loyal, but never enough to walk away powerful. This philosophy became the engine of his rise, shaping every decision he made. Step by step, Luciano molded an empire from intelligence, violence, opportunity, and controlled loyalty. He transformed friendships into partnerships, partnerships into power, and power into a new underworld order that no traditional boss could match. These early alliances were dangerous, unpredictable, and built on constant calculation, but they were the crucible that forged Luciano's future. And through them he proved that the modern American mafia would not be built on old-world honor, but on the strategic mind of a man who understood exactly how to bind people to him, through fear, respect, and profit in perfect balance. The Code of Omerta stands as one of the most defining pillars of the mafia, a rule born from centuries of fear, honor, and survival in the hills and villages of Sicily. Long before the mafia crossed the ocean, Omerta served as both shield and sword, a doctrine built to protect families, allies, and criminal secrets from the reach of authorities or rival clans. At its core, Omerta demanded absolute silence. A man who lived by the code never confessed, never cooperated, and never admitted the truth to anyone outside his trusted circle. Breaking the code meant death, not just for the offender but sometimes for his family as well. It was more than a rule, it was a psychological weapon designed to ensure collective survival through mutual fear and mutual obligation. For Sicilian bosses, Omerta represented purity and discipline. They believed loyalty must be unquestioned and silence must be automatic. Men were expected to obey without hesitation, driven not by reward but by tradition and fear of dishonor. Yet this rigid interpretation created cracks in the old mafia structure, leaving little room for negotiation or evolution. A man either obeyed or died. A boss either punished betrayal or appeared weak. There was no flexibility, no strategic adjustment, only a cycle of fear that demanded blood for every violation. This environment preserved the code but limited its potential as a tool for broader influence. When Lucky Luciano began rising in the American underworld, he respected the foundations of Omerta but quickly recognized its limitations. New York was not Sicily. It was a city of opportunity, diversity, and constant upheaval. Fear alone could not bind men together, especially across ethnic lines. Jewish, Irish, and Italian criminals operated by different rules, and the rigid old-world interpretation of omerta could not hold them in a single structure. Luciano understood that the code had to evolve. Rather than treating loyalty as a sacred, immutable obligation, he treated it as leverage, as something that could be negotiated, rewarded, and reinforced through mutual benefit. Luciano saw that silence did not have to rely solely on fear. It could be bought, earned, and strengthened. If a man profited under his leadership, he had reason to stay silent. If a man gained protection, influence, and opportunity, he had reason to honor the code. Luciano reframed omerta not as blind devotion but as a contract. You stayed loyal because it was in your interest. You kept the secrets because those secrets fed you, enriched you, and kept your enemies far away. This psychological shift allowed Luciano to form alliances far beyond the reach of traditional mafia thinking. To weaponize omerta in this new way, Luciano needed to understand human nature, and he did. He recognized that men were motivated by more than fear. Ambition, greed, pride, and insecurity all shaped their decisions. So he tailored the code to these motivations. Instead of demanding silence because tradition required it, he offered incentives: profits from bootlegging, protection from rival factions, and access to networks that only he controlled. In return, his partners, whether Lansky, Siegel, or influential bootleggers, upheld a version of omerta that bound them through gain rather than blood. This approach revolutionized the underworld. While old bosses punished betrayal with execution, Luciano often prevented betrayal by ensuring loyalty never wavered in the first place. He rewarded those who kept faith with him, promoted those who proved reliable, and removed only those who posed true danger. His interpretation of omerta became strategic rather than emotional. Silence became a currency. Loyalty became a negotiated agreement. And fear became only one component of a broader psychological framework. Through this method, Luciano consolidated power with unprecedented speed. Men who might never have pledged loyalty to a Sicilian don found themselves committed to his system because it offered them more than their previous alliances ever had. Jewish gangsters appreciated the professional respect he extended. Irish crews valued his willingness to collaborate. Even traditional Italian families found themselves adapting to Luciano's model because it produced results they could not ignore. Omerta, once a narrow concept built on heritage and obligation, now expanded into a practical tool that kept entire networks functioning smoothly. One of Luciano's greatest insights was recognizing that the code's strength depended on consistency. If he demanded loyalty, he had to offer stability in return. If he punished betrayal, he had to do so predictably. Men followed him not because they feared random violence but because they knew exactly where they stood. This reliability created confidence, and confidence strengthened loyalty more effectively than fear alone ever could. Luciano understood that a man who trusted his leadership would keep secrets willingly, even proudly, because the success of the organization became his success too. Still, Luciano was never naive about the dangers of betrayal. He knew that even the best alliances required vigilance. When necessary, he enforced omerta with ruthless efficiency. A man who violated the code faced consequences swift enough to deter others. But violence was never the first solution. It was the final one. True power, in Luciano's eyes, came from preventing betrayal through structure, not avenging it through bloodshed. By blending old-world tradition with new-world psychology, Luciano transformed omerta into the backbone of his empire. It became the mechanism that allowed diverse crews to operate as one, sharing profits, risks, and secrets under a unified system. The code no longer belonged solely to Sicilian culture. It belonged to anyone who benefited from Luciano's leadership. This shift marked the birth of a modern syndicate, one where loyalty was both law and leverage, silence both duty and investment. In the end, the genius of Luciano's approach lay in its practicality. He did not ask men to die for honor. He asked them to live for profit. He turned silence into strength, loyalty into currency, and omerta into the glue that held together the first truly organized American criminal network. Through this evolution, he not only preserved the code but redefined it, turning an ancient tradition into a modern instrument of power. Lucky Luciano understood better than any of his predecessors that crime at its highest level was not chaos, it was business. And business required structure, predictability, and above all, stability. By the time he began expanding his influence across New York, the days of small-time hustling were behind him. Gambling, racketeering, prostitution, narcotics, and the growing power of labor unions offered opportunities far larger than what traditional mafia bosses had ever imagined. But these enterprises could not function on force alone. They needed management. They needed organization. They needed alliances that were dependable, disciplined, and motivated to protect the machine they powered. Luciano's genius was recognizing that loyalty was not just a personal virtue, it was the foundation of an industrial-scale criminal network. His gambling operations were the earliest example of this new philosophy. Illegal casinos, bookmaking networks, and numbers rackets all required layers of oversight to prevent theft, corruption, or internal betrayal. Luciano established managers who monitored daily profits, enforcers who ensured compliance, and accountants who tracked the flow of money. Every man had a role, and every role came with both responsibility and reward. The structure resembled legitimate business far more than the chaotic gangs of the past. To keep the system stable, Luciano rewarded those who delivered consistent results and removed anyone who threatened efficiency. Loyalty, in this context, became a contractual obligation rather than an emotional principle. Racketeering offered even greater opportunities. Protection schemes depended on trust. Businesses paid criminals not because they feared violence, but because they trusted that payment would indeed protect them from harm. Luciano professionalized this model. He ensured his lieutenants treated business owners predictably, maintaining regular schedules, fixed fees, and reliable service. The more stable the relationship, the more dependable the income. Unpredictable violence had no place in his design. The system worked because his network behaved like an institution. Organized, structured, and governed by rules that incentivized loyalty and discouraged rogue behavior. Prostitution rings demanded even tighter control. This enterprise required discretion, coordination, and strict oversight, as any mistake could expose the entire operation. Luciano appointed trusted lieutenants to supervise districts, enforce discipline, and maintain both the supply chain and the protection network surrounding it. Those who worked under him knew that loyalty ensured safety, profit, and continuity. Those who broke the code were swiftly removed. By centralizing oversight and dividing management into layers, Luciano created a system where betrayal became difficult and cooperation became profitable. Narcotics distribution, though more controversial within traditional mafia ranks, revealed Luciano's greatest strategic insight. He saw that drugs offered massive profits, and he approached the enterprise with the same structured mindset. Smuggling routes required coordination between international suppliers, transporters, and domestic distributors. This level of complexity demanded absolute trust among participants. Luciano built teams where every individual relied on the next, each man dependent on the system for income and protection. He understood the psychology of loyalty. Men stayed loyal when loyalty guaranteed prosperity. The stability he offered ensured that even high-risk operations ran smoothly, protected by predictable procedures and shared interests. Union control became one of Luciano's most powerful tools. By infiltrating and influencing labor unions, he gained access to shipping ports, construction sites, trucking lines, and strike negotiations. This influence gave him leverage over entire industries. To maintain such control, he installed trusted lieutenants as union leaders, negotiators, and intermediaries. Their loyalty was reinforced through profit sharing, protection, and the opportunity to wield real power. But their authority was always tied back to Luciano. He designed the hierarchy so that no lieutenant could operate independently or challenge him. Each man controlled a piece of the machine, but only Luciano controlled the machine itself. This layered structure was the foundation of his criminal empire. Luciano divided his organization into clear sectors: gambling, racketeering, prostitution, narcotics, and labor. Each had supervisors, collectors, enforcers, and accountants. Above them stood regional captains who ensured smooth operations, handled disputes, and reported directly to Luciano. The model mirrored corporate management, with Luciano serving as CEO. But unlike a legitimate corporation, this enterprise depended entirely on secrecy and trust. One disloyal lieutenant could expose thousands of workers, dozens of operations, and millions in profits. Loyalty was no longer a personal matter, it was a structural necessity. To maintain stability, Luciano cultivated loyalty through balance. He provided his lieutenants with enough authority to feel powerful but not enough to grow independent. He shared profits generously, ensuring that every man understood the benefits of the system. He encouraged cooperation between ethnic groups, Jews, Italians, and Irish working together under a unified model. Each benefited from the arrangement, and each understood that betrayal threatened not just Luciano but the entire network supporting them. Conflict, when it arose, was handled strategically. Luciano rarely relied solely on violence. Instead, he used mediation, financial compromise, or reassignment to resolve disputes. Violence was a last resort, employed only when essential to maintaining order. His lieutenants learned that predictable leadership created predictable outcomes. And predictable outcomes created loyalty. Luciano's innovations reshaped the American underworld permanently. He proved that crime, when organized with intelligence, could function like legitimate business, efficient, controlled, and immensely profitable. He also proved that loyalty was not something to demand blindly but something to engineer systematically. His networks thrived because he understood that stability required trust, and trust required structure. Every enterprise he built depended on alliances that were strengthened by shared profit, mutual necessity, and clear hierarchy. Luciano's structure became the blueprint for future generations of organized crime leaders, proving that stability was the ultimate currency. His blend of management, incentive, and controlled authority allowed operations to grow without collapsing under pressure. Even rivals eventually adopted his methods, recognizing that without dependable alliances and disciplined networks, no empire, legal or illegal, could endure. His model endures because he built crime as business, not chaos or chance. Lucky Luciano's rise to power was not shaped only by his brilliance or ambition, but by the dangerous men orbiting him, monsters he had to evaluate, manipulate, and sometimes eliminate. In the American underworld of the early 20th century, alliances were not friendships. They were arrangements forged from necessity, fear, and calculated advantage. Luciano learned quickly that the wrong ally could destroy everything, while the right one could elevate him to heights the old-world bosses never imagined. His ascent became a delicate dance on a razor's edge, balancing loyalty, deception, and survival as he navigated some of the most formidable figures in organized crime. The first major force in Luciano's path was Joe, the boss Masuria, a tyrant forged in the traditions of old Sicily. Masuria ruled through blunt force, paranoia, and rigid adherence to the codes he believed kept him untouchable. To him, loyalty was unquestionable obedience. Allies were tools, and violence was always the first solution. Luciano recognized Masuria's power but also saw the limits of his worldview. The old Don could not adapt, could not negotiate across cultures, and could not envision an underworld built on cooperation rather than domination. Luciano pretended loyalty, presenting himself as a devoted young soldier while quietly building networks Masuria would never approve of. The arrangement was pure manipulation. Luciano used Masuria's protection while expanding far beyond his reach. Yet serving such a man came with constant danger. Masuria trusted no one, including Luciano, and every day under him was a test of patience and survival. Still, Luciano understood the value of learning from a tyrant. Masuria embodied everything the next generation could no longer afford to be. If Masuria represented the outdated brutality of the past, Salvatore Maranzano embodied its refined ambition. Maranzano arrived from Sicily with a mind sharpened by strategy and a sense of superiority shaped by ancient tradition. Unlike Masuria, he was not crude. He was deliberate, composed, and dangerously intelligent. He admired Roman history and believed the mafia should mirror the structure of an empire, with himself as Caesar. At first, Luciano saw promise in Maranzano. His discipline, organization, and willingness to modernize appealed to Luciano's vision for a more efficient underworld. But admiration quickly turned to caution. Maranzano wanted more than order, he wanted absolute power. His attempts to reorganize the mafia into a strict hierarchy placed him at the top and everyone else beneath him. He began hiring assassins, collecting information, and eliminating anyone he perceived as a threat. Luciano realized that Maranzano, for all his elegance, was more dangerous than Masuria. Tyrants were predictable, ambitious strategists were not. Maranzano's vision left no room for men like Luciano to grow. An alliance with him was only temporary, a bridge to something greater, but a bridge that would eventually have to be burned. Not every potential ally entered Luciano's orbit through tradition. Some emerged from the chaotic world of non-Italian gangs, none more infamous than Dutch Schultz. Schultz was bold, ruthless, and volatile, a man who ruled through fear but lacked the discipline that Luciano valued. His empire spanned bootlegging, numbers rackets, and extortion, yet his impulses often turned opportunity into catastrophe. Schultz was unpredictable, prone to drunken rages, and dangerously dismissive of consequences. Luciano recognized his power but refused to align with him. He understood that Schultz's instability would eventually destroy him, and anyone tied to him. This refusal became one of Luciano's most important decisions. When Schultz plotted to assassinate prosecutor Thomas Dewey, Luciano realized the threat had grown too large. Interference from Schultz would bring federal attention capable of dismantling the entire underworld. Rather than joining him, Luciano helped eliminate him, protecting both his allies and his future. Schultz represented everything Luciano rejected: recklessness, ego, and short-sighted aggression. But Luciano's most complicated relationship, perhaps the most dangerous of all, was with Vito Genovese, a man as brilliant as he was treacherous. Genovese possessed sharp instincts, deep ambition, and a willingness to do whatever it took to rise. He admired Luciano, learned from him, and served under him with apparent loyalty. Yet beneath that loyalty was envy, resentment, and dreams of replacing him. Genovese believed that fear, not diplomacy, was the true source of power. His brutality was efficient but excessive, and his ambition often overshadowed good judgment. Luciano trusted him only to the extent that he understood him. Genovese was useful but never safe. Allies like Lansky and Siegel strengthened Luciano's empire. Genovese threatened its foundation. Luciano kept him close because his intelligence was undeniable, but never close enough to gain real control. This dynamic defined their relationship for years: dependence intertwined with suspicion, partnership overshadowed by the certainty of future betrayal. Navigating these men required more than courage, it required mastery of human psychology. Luciano understood that every ally was also a potential enemy, and every enemy could become an ally under the right circumstances. Masuria taught him the danger of outdated power. Maranzano taught him the danger of ambition without limits. Schultz taught him the danger of unpredictability. Genovese taught him the danger of envy. These lessons became the core of Luciano's leadership philosophy: never rely on one man, never grant unchecked authority, and always align interests so tightly that betrayal becomes more costly than loyalty. Luciano walked a razor's edge every day. To survive Masuria, he had to appear obedient. To survive Maranzano, he had to appear cooperative. To survive Schultz, he had to appear neutral. To survive Genovese, he had to remain indispensable. Every alliance was a performance, every decision a balancing act. He could not present too much independence or he would be targeted. He could not present too much loyalty or he would be underestimated. He occupied the narrow space between asset and threat, building influence quietly while men far older and more powerful underestimated him until it was too late. In the end, Luciano's greatness came not from choosing the strongest allies, but from choosing the right monsters, and knowing exactly when those monsters had to be removed. His rise was not a story of friendship, but of strategy. He understood the cost of trust, the price of loyalty, and the danger of ambition. And through this mastery he became the architect of a new underworld, built on alliances that served him until the moment they no longer could. The Castellammarese War was more than a gang conflict. It was a shadow war fought in whispers, betrayals, and calculated murders, a silent storm reshaping the American underworld. For more than 2 years, the streets of New York shook beneath the ambitions of two titans: Joe Masuria, the entrenched tyrant clinging to old-world dominance, and Salvatore Maranzano, the refined Sicilian strategist determined to seize absolute control. Between them stood Lucky Luciano, a man who had learned to navigate monsters, a man whose loyalty could be performed convincingly enough to fool the very men he planned to destroy. By the beginning of the war, Masuria's brutal leadership had become a chokehold on progress. His paranoia shut out innovation, and his refusal to trust non-Sicilians crippled opportunities. Luciano recognized the coming collapse. If he stayed loyal, he would go down with Masuria. If he opposed him openly, he would be killed. Thus began the hidden war within the war, a silent negotiation between Luciano and his own survival. Maranzano, recently arrived from the old country, sensed Luciano's ambition and reached out quietly. Their first meeting was a test of intellect. Maranzano admired Luciano's modern mindset, while Luciano admired Maranzano's discipline. But admiration did not mean trust. Luciano saw in Maranzano a man who believed himself destined to rule, a man who valued men like Luciano only as instruments. Still, both understood a single truth: Masuria had to fall for the mafia to evolve. And so, Luciano agreed to a secret pact: he would remove Masuria in exchange for a peaceful and unified future. The psychological weight of this decision began immediately. Masuria had trusted Luciano more than anyone else. He shared meals with him, confided in him, and depended on him to enforce his will. Luciano learned to nod, smile, and obey while feeding Maranzano information behind the scenes. Every handshake with Masuria became a test of Luciano's poker face. Every order received from the old Don reminded him that betrayal, once started, could never be undone. At night, he lay awake haunted by the knowledge that the man he pretended to protect would soon die by his command. Yet Misuria's tyranny made the choice inevitable. His recklessness threatened everyone. Men were dying in alleys, cafes, and sidewalks daily, victims of a war Misuria refused to end. Luciano justified the betrayal as necessary for survival, for himself, for his allies, and for the future he envisioned. But justification did not eliminate guilt. Carrying out betrayal was a wound of its own. The assassination of Joe Misuria on April 15, 1931, unfolded like a grim performance Luciano had rehearsed countless times. He arranged a card game at Coney Island, sitting across from the man who had shaped so much of his early underworld life. Luciano excused himself to the bathroom, leaving Misuria at the table. Immediately, gunmen stormed in and executed Misuria in a blur of smoke and bullets. The plan was flawless. The act was final. But Luciano felt its weight more deeply than he expected. He had killed men before, but killing Misuria meant killing the past, killing the very structure that had once protected him. He walked away from the scene knowing he had stepped beyond redemption in the eyes of old-world loyalty. Yet he also walked away closer to the future he intended to build. With Misuria gone, Maranzano rose to power almost instantly. He reorganized the mafia into 5 families and declared himself capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses. At first, Luciano believed he had chosen the right victor. But Maranzano's mask slipped quickly. He demanded absolute obedience, imposed rigid hierarchies, and began scrutinizing every man around him. He believed Luciano was talented, but he also believed Luciano was dangerous. Secretly, Maranzano ordered Luciano's assassination, unaware that Luciano's network was already listening. The psychological torment returned in full force. Luciano had already betrayed one man who trusted him. Now he faced betraying another. Maranzano, unlike Misuria, had treated him like a student worthy of elevation. He respected Luciano's vision but feared his independence. That fear sealed his fate. Luciano realized that replacing one tyrant with another would undo everything he had risked. The war would never end as long as a supreme leader sat above the 5 families. This time, Luciano's betrayal was not a reluctant murder. It was a strategic necessity. If he did not strike first, he would die. Still, orchestrating the death of a man who believed in him required a different kind of strength. To kill Maranzano was to kill the last grand figure of the old world. Luciano knew this act would forever define him. On September 10, 1931, Luciano sent trusted Jewish associates, disguised as federal agents, into Maranzano's office. Guns were drawn. The self-proclaimed Caesar of the Mafia fell, shocked, betrayed, and defeated. Luciano, waiting miles away, felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. The deed was necessary, but the cost was immense. Betrayal, even strategic betrayal, left scars no victory could erase. With both Misuria and Maranzano dead, the Castellamarese War ended. Luciano stepped forward not as a tyrant, but as an architect. He abolished the title of boss of all bosses and created the Commission, a board of equal families designed to prevent future wars. Loyalty was no longer personal, it became structural. Power was now distributed, not concentrated. Luciano's betrayals had been the blood price required to build something sustainable. But he never forgot the weight of what he had done. He had outsmarted tyrants, survived assassins, and united enemies. Yet behind every triumph lingered the psychological truth that his rise was paid for in blood, blood of men who once believed he stood beside them. The hidden war did not merely reshape the mafia, it reshaped Luciano himself. It taught him that loyalty was never simple, that survival required choices no moral man could celebrate, and that leadership demanded sacrifices few could endure. Through assassination, deception, and carefully orchestrated betrayal, Luciano built the first unified American criminal empire, not through inherited power, but through the brutal clarity of vision that only war can forge. Lucky Luciano's greatest achievement was not a single assassination or a clever alliance. It was the creation of a political system for criminals, a structure so stable and forward-thinking that it reshaped the underworld for generations. This system, known as the Commission, transformed loyalty from a personal promise into an institutional requirement. It was a machine designed to manage dangerous men, balance rival ambitions, and prevent the blood-soaked chaos that had nearly destroyed the Mafia during the Castellamarese War. Before the Commission, the Mafia operated like a patchwork monarchy. Each boss ruled absolutely, guided by ego, tradition, and whatever version of honor he believed in. Conflicts were inevitable. A slight could spark a vendetta. A business dispute could erupt into war. There were no rules governing territory, arbitration, or succession. When Misuria and Maranzano battled for supremacy, the city bled for their ambitions. Luciano believed that if the mafia was to survive, it needed what every nation eventually requires: a government. So in 1931, after both tyrants had been removed, Luciano called together the leaders of the five families, Genovese, Bonanno, Prophesai, Mangano and Lucchese, along with significant Jewish and Irish partners. What he proposed was revolutionary. There would be no more boss of all bosses, no ultimate ruler whose paranoia could plunge the underworld into conflict. Instead, each family would be sovereign, controlling its own territory and operations. Above them would sit the commission, a voting body that met to resolve disputes, approve leadership changes and coordinate national strategy. Loyalty under this model became political. No longer pledged to an individual, it was pledged to the system itself. Bosses owed allegiance to the commission's rules, not to a single tyrant. The structure resembled a federation, independent states bound by common interest. It echoed principles of the U.S. Constitution, which Luciano admired for its checks and balances. In his world, checks prevented reckless bosses from starting wars. Balances ensured no family could overpower the others. For Luciano, this system accomplished several objectives at once. First, it stabilized alliances. War became costly and bureaucratically complicated, requiring commission approval. Second, it institutionalized cooperation between families that historically despised one another. Third, it protected profits. When violence decreased, revenue increased. With predictable leadership and predictable responses, criminal enterprise could scale. The commission also served as an intelligence network. Bosses shared information about law enforcement pressure, political connections, and national expansion. If one family faced heat, the others adjusted operations to protect the whole. Loyalty now meant mutual survival. Betraying another family risked punishment not from a single boss but from the entire governing body. That collective power gave the commission enormous authority. Luciano further expanded the model by integrating non-Italian allies into the network. Meyer Lansky, long his closest strategist, played a crucial advisory role. Jewish gangs gained representation in national decision-making, aligning their interests with Italian families. This cooperation opened doors to Las Vegas investments, Cuban operations and sophisticated financial schemes. For the first time, ethnicity became secondary to profit. Loyalty flowed upward to the system, not sideways to cultural identity. Yet the commission's brilliance lay in how it managed dangerous men without stripping them of power. Bosses still controlled their families. Soldiers still swore oaths. Capos still enforced discipline. But personal ambition was contained. A boss who attempted to seize too much territory or escalate violence would face consequences from the collective. This created a new kind of underworld psychology. Restraint became a sign of leadership, not weakness. Luciano also introduced mechanisms for succession. Instead of assassinations determining leadership changes, the commission could approve transitions, preventing families from splintering into violent factions. Disputes over money, territory, or betrayal were mediated in meetings rather than fought in streets. Luciano had turned the mafia into a political entity with procedures that protected both stability and profit. The commission's impact was immediate. Violence across New York decreased. Revenue surged. Families expanded into national rackets. Florida gambling, Detroit unions, Chicago distribution networks, all coordinated through the governing body. Luciano's model transformed crime from a local enterprise into a national syndicate. It provided the framework that allowed the mafia to operate like a corporation, with departments, oversight, and long-term planning. But creating the commission also gave Luciano unrivaled influence. He was not its dictator, but he was its architect, the man everyone trusted to interpret its purpose. His mastery of diplomacy, his alliances with Jewish partners, and his reputation for fairness made him the unofficial prime minister of the American mafia. Dangerous men respected him because he had given them something they had never possessed before: a future. Still, the commission was not without vulnerability. It depended on cooperation and reason, traits not typical of violent criminals. Luciano understood this and designed the system with enforcement mechanisms. A family that violated agreements could be fined, sanctioned, or terminated. Assassination remained a tool, but a regulated one, requiring approval rather than impulse. This blend of freedom and restraint kept the organization intact for decades. Loyalty under the commission became multifaceted. Soldiers remained loyal to capos. Capos remained loyal to bosses. Bosses remained loyal to the system. And the system remained loyal to profit. It was a chain of incentives rather than emotions, built to minimize betrayal by making cooperation more beneficial than rebellion. In building the commission, Luciano accomplished something extraordinary. He tamed the very men who had once threatened him. He created a machine that turned monsters into managers, killers into diplomats, and rival families into stakeholders in a united criminal economy. This system was his masterpiece, the culmination of everything he learned from surviving tyrants, navigating wars, and understanding human ambition. By institutionalizing loyalty, he ensured that the mafia would endure long after he was gone. And in doing so, he built the closest thing the underworld ever had to a government. One designed not for justice but for survival, power, and profit. For years, Lucky Luciano built an empire on alliances stronger than fear and far more profitable than tradition. His commission kept the peace, his networks flourished, and his authority stretched across cities and industries. But even the most perfectly engineered machine can crack from within. As government pressure mounted, enemies evolved, and ambitions sharpened in the shadows, Luciano discovered the flaw that would haunt every ruler. Loyalty, no matter how carefully constructed, is never permanent. It bends, weakens, corrodes, and eventually breaks. The first fractures appeared not in the streets, but in courtrooms and newspapers. The United States government had begun to understand that organized crime was no longer a collection of isolated gangs. Luciano's structure, efficient, disciplined, and national, terrified prosecutors. District Attorney Thomas E. Dewey made it his mission to destroy him. Raids increased, surveillance intensified, and the press labeled Luciano the most dangerous racketeer in America. Luciano had survived gang wars and tyrants, but this was a new enemy, the law, relentless and politically motivated. And unlike rival bosses, the government could not be bribed, intimidated, or negotiated with. As outside pressure grew, internal pressure intensified as well. The man watching closest was Vito Genovese, Luciano's ambitious, cunning lieutenant. Genovese had served under him for years, but he had never accepted a permanent position in the shadow of another. He believed himself destined to lead. And now, with law enforcement tightening its grip on their operations, he sensed an opportunity. Loyalty to Luciano had been easy when Luciano was untouchable. But a boss under scrutiny is a boss exposed, and exposure invited predators. Genovese began whispering doubts into the ears of capos, questioning Luciano's ability to shield the families from prosecutors. He portrayed himself as a more traditional leader, one who would revive old-world values and rule with fear rather than diplomacy. Some men, frightened of Dewey's crusade, listened. Others dismissed Genovese as opportunistic. But the damage was done. Suspicion had entered the bloodstream of the organization. Luciano felt the shift instantly. He had spent years reading men, and now the same instincts that had protected him in the streets warned him again. Conversations grew shorter. Answers delayed. Eye contact avoided. Men who once greeted him with confidence now offered rehearsed loyalty, too polished to be sincere. Luciano's kingdom, once unified by common interest, was beginning to fracture under the weight of fear and ambition. And the government's campaign made those fractures fatal. Dewey's prosecution built a narrative that Luciano controlled prostitution with an iron fist, orchestrating operations from hotels and nightclubs. Luciano denied the charges, but public sentiment was against him. Worse, several of his associates, men who had once sworn loyalty, broke omerta and testified against him. These betrayals cut deeper than bullets. Luciano had built an empire by believing loyalty could be engineered through fairness, profit, and structure. Now, under pressure, men he trusted sold him out for shorter sentences and government protection. Each betrayal reinforced a brutal truth. Even the greatest system could not override human desperation. While the trial unfolded, Genovese positioned himself for power. With Luciano distracted, he strengthened alliances, expanded influence, and whispered promises of a new era. Some capos swayed, believing Luciano would never return to the streets. Genovese's ambition grew so bold that he even plotted assassinations, hoping to remove obstacles before Luciano could respond. But fate stalled his plans. Accused of murder, Genovese fled to Italy, delaying his takeover, but not erasing the threat. Luciano knew he was not gone, only waiting. When the final verdict arrived, it was devastating: 30 to 50 years in prison. Luciano, the architect of modern organized crime, was now confined to a cell. The alliances he built could not save him, and the men he trusted could not, or would not, shield him. His empire would continue, but he would not control it directly. For the first time, Luciano faced the limits of his own brilliance. Loyalty, he learned, is strongest when untested. Under pressure, it reveals its true shape. From behind bars, Luciano watched the underworld shift. Some men remained loyal, channeling money and decisions back to him. Others abandoned him entirely, aligning with rising bosses eager to carve out their own legacy. The commission he had built survived, but its unity weakened. Without Luciano's balancing presence, old tensions resurfaced. Territories were contested, alliances endangered, and rivalries rekindled. Worst of all, Genovese continued maneuvering from Italy. Distance did not diminish his ambition. He spread rumors that Luciano's imprisonment was a sign of weakness, claiming the families needed a real Sicilian leader, someone who embraced fear and dominance rather than cooperation. His message appealed to traditionalists and opportunists alike. And though Luciano still commanded respect, his influence was fading. Power, like loyalty, erodes when not actively reinforced. Even among his closest allies, Luciano sensed fractures. Some feared being associated too closely with him. Others questioned whether following an imprisoned boss was wise. These were not betrayals born from malice, but from survival instinct. The same instinct Luciano himself had once used to navigate dangerous tyrants. He understood them even if he despised the consequences. Loyalty had become unpredictable, fluid, fragile, and deadly. In the quiet hours of his imprisonment, Luciano reflected on the irony of his situation. He had survived the Castellamarese War, outmaneuvered tyrants, forged alliances across cultures, and built the strongest criminal organization in American history. He had tamed monsters and reshaped an empire. Yet the forces that ultimately unraveled his power were not bullets or rival gangs. They were ambition, fear, and government pressure, forces even he could not negotiate with. Luciano realized that the same intelligence that allowed him to construct alliances also made him understand why they collapsed. Men follow power and power follows freedom. Once he was caged, the equations changed. Those who stayed loyal did so out of respect. Those who defected did so out of fear or opportunity. The system he built endured, but it evolved without him. He had created a machine designed to limit the chaos of human nature. Yet human nature remained the one variable no institution could fully control. In the end, Luciano's downfall was not a failure of strategy, but a reminder of the limits of influence. Even the greatest alliance maker cannot control every ambition or silence every fear. Loyalty, he learned, is never absolute. It is a living thing, shifting, unpredictable, and dangerous. And for the first time in his life, Lucky Luciano found himself on the wrong side of its sharp edge. The courtroom became a stage where Lucky Luciano's empire was dismantled piece by piece, not by bullets or rival bosses, but by witnesses, headlines, and political ambition. 4 years, Luciano had ruled from the shadows, a strategist who shaped the underworld with alliances and structure. Now he sat under bright lights, facing a prosecutor who intended to destroy everything he built. Thomas E. Dewey, young, relentless, and hungry for fame, saw Luciano as the perfect target, an enemy whose conviction would make him a national figure. From the first day, the trial felt like a spectacle. Reporters crowded the aisles, photographers snapped relentlessly, and every gesture Luciano made appeared in the next morning's papers. Dewey understood the power of public opinion and framed the case dramatically, calling Luciano the architect of a massive prostitution ring. It was not the crime itself that mattered, it was the message. By portraying Luciano as the mastermind of an organized, widespread criminal enterprise, Dewey aimed to prove that no man was beyond the reach of the law. Luciano watched calmly, but beneath his composure ran a deep unease. The prosecution's strategy was clever. They used his own organizational brilliance as evidence against him. Dewey described the mafia hierarchy, the chains of command, the networks of collectors and enforcers. The same structure Luciano had designed to stabilize the underworld now painted him as the head of a criminal corporation. Dewey argued that nothing significant happened without Luciano's approval, and the jury listened. Then came the witnesses. At first they were minor figures, brothel workers, small-time pimps, people who had lived on the edge of Luciano's world. Their testimony was inconsistent, sometimes contradictory, but always delivered with dramatic certainty. Some claimed Luciano set prices, others claimed he ordered punishments. Luciano recognized many of them. Some had once begged him for help or protection. Hearing them twist his name into accusations felt like a quiet betrayal. But the real destruction came when members of his own network took the stand. These were not outsiders. They were men who had eaten at his table, shaken his hand, sworn omerta. Now, facing prison time, they offered Dewey whatever he wanted. Their voices filled the courtroom with stories, some partly true, many invented, linking Luciano to the prostitution racket. Each confession felt like another pillar sinking beneath the weight of pressure and fear. Luciano had built his empire on loyalty engineered through fairness, respect, and profit. Yet under threat, those loyalties evaporated. He did not show anger. He did not look away. But inside he felt the sting of watching the code he believed in collapse in public view. Dewey seized every opportunity. He portrayed Luciano as a predator who controlled every aspect of the underworld. He dramatized the witnesses' stories, turning them into proof of Luciano's iron rule. When a former madam testified with confidence and polished detail, claiming Luciano oversaw the entire network, the courtroom reacted instantly. Her performance shaped the narrative, and the newspapers amplified it. The jury began to see not the strategist Luciano truly was, but the monster Dewey described. No amount of cross-examination could undo the damage. Outside the courtroom, the fallout spread quickly. The commission distanced itself. Allies stayed silent. Some capos quietly shifted their loyalties, preparing for the possibility that Luciano might never return. Even his closest supporters felt uncertainty. No one dared openly challenge Dewey's momentum, and no one wanted to be dragged down with the man under fire. Luciano understood. It was not personal, it was survival. The same instincts that once allowed him to build an empire were now working against him. Fear replaced loyalty, and fear was a force he could not negotiate with from inside a courtroom. As the trial progressed, Luciano came to see the deeper irony. He had designed the mafia to function without relying on tradition alone. He created a structure that encouraged cooperation and rational decision-making. But structure also created vulnerability. Once the government understood his design, they used it as a map, one that pointed straight to him. By the final week, the verdict felt inevitable. The jurors entered with solemn expressions. Luciano sat still, jaw tight, eyes forward. When the foreman announced guilty, a ripple of murmurs swept the room. Dewey kept his expression measured, but triumph glinted in his eyes. Luciano nodded once, accepting the moment with the same calm he used in negotiation. The sentence followed shortly after, 30 to 50 years in prison. The harshest penalty ever given for such charges. Flashes burst from cameras as officers stepped forward to take Luciano away. He did not resist, did not shout, did not plead. His silence was not surrender, it was dignity. He understood that no argument could save him. Loyalty had collapsed. Allies had vanished. His structure, once the strongest force in the underworld, had become the prosecution's blueprint. As he walked from the courtroom, Luciano felt a strange emptiness. Not fear, he had faced death before. Not anger, rage could not undo betrayal. It was something quieter, heavier. The realization that even the greatest alliances cannot withstand the pressure of survival. Men he trusted had chosen themselves. Laws he once evaded now trapped him. The empire he built endured, but without him. For the first time since his youth on the Lower East Side, Lucky Luciano faced a future entirely out of his control. Prison did not silence Lucky Luciano. It only changed the room in which he commanded. The steel bars, the concrete walls, the long echo of gates locking behind him, none of it erased the authority he had spent a lifetime constructing. Even stripped of freedom, Luciano remained a presence felt far beyond the prison yard, a man whose shadow still stretched through city streets, union halls, gambling rooms, and back-alley negotiations. His power was diminished but not destroyed. Some loyalties, forged through respect rather than fear, survived the collapse that had brought him here. From the moment Luciano entered Clinton Correctional Facility, whispers spread. Inmates watched him with curiosity, some with awe, others with suspicion. Guards kept their distance. Administrators noted that he was not like ordinary prisoners. He carried himself with deliberate calm, the same composure he once used to negotiate with killers and kingpins. To many he seemed like a dethroned monarch, fallen yet still dangerous. Outside the prison walls, the world he built continued turning. The commission functioned. Families operated. National rackets remained intact. But everything felt different without Luciano's direct hand guiding decisions. Some lieutenants drifted toward infighting. Others attempted to seize greater control. Yet a core group, those closest to him, those who understood the architecture of his empire, remained loyal. Not because they feared him but because they respected the vision he had created. No ally embodied this loyalty more than Meyer Lansky. Lansky had never betrayed him, never distanced himself, never considered replacing him. While other men sought advantage, Lansky sought stability. He ensured operations ran smoothly, that profits continued flowing, and that the structure Luciano designed did not unravel under the weight of new ambitions. Every few weeks, Lansky sent messages through trusted intermediaries, updates, questions, reassurances. Though coded and discreet, the communications carried something deeper than business: loyalty that had survived prosecution, betrayal, and public ruin. Luciano valued these messages more than anything else in prison. In Lansky's consistency, he found confirmation that some bonds could endure even when circumstances turned hostile. Lansky did not need Luciano's approval anymore, yet he still sought it. To him, Luciano was not just a leader, he was a partner, a friend, and the architect of a world they had built together from street corners and scratched-out dreams. Other lieutenants also stayed loyal. Men like Frank Costello maintained political influence in New York, using connections to protect the families from unnecessary scrutiny. They made decisions with Luciano's principles in mind: avoid bloodshed, maximize profit, and keep the commission functioning as a governing body rather than a battleground. Even imprisoned, Luciano's philosophy shaped their actions. And then there were soldiers, men who had never spoken to Luciano directly but respected him by reputation alone. To them, he was the innovator who had ended wars, the architect who had given the mafia a future. They feared disappointing him even if he was locked away miles from their turf. When disputes arose, capos often asked, "What would Charlie want?" His name still carried weight, even when spoken in low tones behind closed doors. Yet despite this remaining influence, Luciano felt the burden of betrayal in a way he never had before. Prison gave him time, too much time, to reflect on the meaning of loyalty, its cost, and the illusions he had once believed about its permanence. In the quiet of his cell, he replayed the faces of those who had broken omerta, men who had sworn allegiance and then folded under pressure. He wondered whether he had misread them, whether his belief that loyalty could be engineered was flawed. Through these reflections, Luciano came to understand something deeper. Loyalty that is purchased or negotiated can endure only as long as the incentives remain. True loyalty survives even when the balance shifts. Lansky remained loyal because he believed in Luciano, not because Luciano could reward or punish him. Costello stayed loyal because he respected Luciano's vision, not because he needed his approval. These were bonds not created by structure, but by shared identity and purpose. Luciano also recognized another truth: loyalty was not just about allegiance. It was about expectation. The underworld still expected him to lead, to advise, to guide. Even behind bars, Luciano had influence because others believed he still mattered. And belief, he realized, was the most powerful currency of all. As long as men believed in him, he had power. But prison also forced him to confront the loneliness of leadership. He had built an empire based on understanding human nature, yet human nature had toppled him. Ambition, fear, and survival instinct had shattered alliances he thought unbreakable. Now he spent nights staring at the ceiling, wondering if he had been naive to trust some men, or foolish to believe loyalty could ever be universal. Yet despite the doubts, Luciano knew he was not defeated. The government had his body but not his influence. His ideas lived on. His structure lived on. His allies, though fewer than before, still protected his legacy. And the underworld, cold, violent, unpredictable, still operated partly in fear of disappointing him. Even the thought of Luciano's displeasure kept some men in line. In a way, prison purified Luciano's understanding of loyalty. It stripped away the illusions, revealing who remained when everything else fell apart. The betrayal that destroyed his empire had also revealed its strongest foundations. And those foundations, though smaller than before, were unshakable. Luciano learned to lead from the shadows, to guide through whispers rather than commands. He reshaped his influence into something quieter but more refined. His counsel flowed through corridors of power he could no longer walk. His name guided decisions he would never witness. And in this unexpected way he discovered a new kind of power, one built not on fear or structure but on respect and memory. Behind bars, Lucky Luciano discovered the rarest form of loyalty, the loyalty that survives even when power does not. When Lucky Luciano was deported to Italy in 1946, he stepped onto the ship knowing he was leaving behind not just America, but the center of his power. He had always believed influence came from presence, from being in the room, reading faces, shaping decisions. Exile shattered that rule. The moment the coastline faded, Luciano felt something he had rarely felt before: distance. And with distance came the slow unraveling of loyalty. Arriving in Naples, he tried to carry the authority that once defined him, but the city treated him differently. Italy was not the New York underworld he had mastered. Police shadowed his movements. Informants monitored his visitors. Local mafia families respected his legacy, but they did not answer to him. To them he was a legend, not a leader. Legends inspire stories, not orders. Still, Luciano attempted to maintain control over American operations. He arranged coded correspondence, used trusted couriers, and held quiet meetings with visiting allies. Through these channels he tried to advise on gambling expansion, labor negotiations, and narcotics routes. For a time, some of his influence remained intact. Men he had raised and guided still valued his insight. But every month the distance grew heavier. Decisions he once made instantly now required weeks. Advice that once shaped the commission now arrived too late to matter. Only a handful of people continued to treat his word as law, none more loyal than Meyer Lansky. Lansky visited when he could, ensuring Luciano received news from America. Their conversations were part strategy, part friendship, part remembrance. Lansky's loyalty did not fade with circumstance. It survived because it had been built on mutual respect rather than fear. Costello also remained reliable, maintaining political alliances and shielding operations that Luciano had once overseen. But while loyalty endured in small pockets, the structure Luciano had built began shifting under the influence of ambitious men. The most dangerous of them, Vito Genovese, used Luciano's absence like an open door. Genovese returned to America determined to reshape the mafia in his own image. He told others that Luciano's time had passed, that the families needed leadership rooted at home, not across the ocean. With Luciano exiled, Genovese quietly mobilized support, weakening the foundation Luciano had spent years constructing. Luciano saw this happening from afar, and the helplessness gnawed at him. He had survived betrayals, assassinations, and a courtroom spectacle, but nothing tormented him like watching his empire slip out of his grasp while he remained trapped behind borders he could not cross. He sent warnings, strategic advice, and pleas for unity. Some listened, others pretended to listen. But Genovese was relentless, and distance made resistance nearly impossible. Luciano's world shrank. Days passed with little more than walks through Naples, conversations with curious locals, and occasional visits from old associates who treated him with reverence instead of relevance. In New York, new bosses rose, new conflicts emerged, and new money flowed, much of it beyond his reach. He became a symbol, a story men told to explain how the commission began. But stories cannot command armies. Loneliness soon replaced authority. Luciano had spent most of his life surrounded by people, advisors, soldiers, allies, rivals. Now he woke to quiet streets, unfamiliar voices, and a world that did not depend on him. For the first time he had no territory to direct, no alliances to mend, no wars to prevent. Influence, his greatest weapon, had dissolved into memory. Yet the loneliness taught him something he had never fully understood, the true nature of loyalty. In America, loyalty had been a currency, earned, negotiated, enforced. But in exile he saw that real loyalty could not be bought or structured. It came from history, from trust, from shared struggle. Lansky's visits proved that. So did the occasional coded letters from men who still looked to Luciano for wisdom, even if they no longer needed his permission. But the mafia no longer belonged to him. It evolved with new strategies and new rivalries. Genovese's rise reshaped the landscape entirely. The commission still operated, but its priorities shifted. Younger bosses saw Luciano as foundational, not functional. His era was not forgotten, but it had closed. The new generation admired him, yet they forged their own paths. Despite this, Luciano never fully detached from the world he built. He hosted discreet meetings with international figures, explored opportunities in Havana, and continued to observe shifts in American power. Each move was an attempt to remain relevant, to prove he still mattered. But he knew deep down that influence from afar was influence in name only. In quiet moments, Luciano reflected on the irony of his life. He had risen from a street kid to the architect of modern organized crime, shaping an empire more durable than any single boss. But in exile he understood the cost of such creation. Once a structure is strong enough to stand alone, it no longer needs its builder. The commission had outgrown him. As years passed, the world changed further. Law enforcement adapted. International crime evolved. Yet Luciano remained frozen in time, respected, remembered, but no longer essential. The underworld feared disappointing him, but no longer feared disobeying him. In his final years, Luciano became a figure suspended between relevance and legend. Visitors treated him like a myth, a symbol of a bygone era. They sought stories, not orders. They wanted history, not hierarchy. When he died at Naples International Airport in 1962, the mafia mourned him, but not as a ruler. They mourned him as the man who had once brought order to chaos, who had built a system powerful enough to survive without him. In death, he became what exile had already begun turning him into. A memory that shaped the world long after the man himself could no longer touch it. Lucky Luciano's legacy survived long after his exile, long after his influence faded, long after the men he once commanded reshaped the underworld without him. He became more than a boss, he became the architect of modern organized crime. His ideas outlived his authority, and his structure endured even when he no longer controlled it. In death, Luciano achieved what few criminals ever have. He became a blueprint. Before Luciano, the mafia in America had been chaotic, tribal, and trapped in the customs of Sicily. Bosses ruled like kings, demanding loyalty rooted in fear and heritage. Disputes erupted into violence, and ambition led to endless bloodshed. Luciano recognized that such a system could not survive in a modern, rapidly changing America. If the mafia was to thrive, it needed formality, cooperation, and rules. And so he built the Commission, a governing council that replaced absolute power with collective management. It became the stabilizing heartbeat of organized crime for decades. Each family retained control over its own territory, but all were bound by shared laws and mandatory cooperation. Instead of vendettas, disputes were mediated. Instead of sudden wars, conflicts required approval. The Commission functioned as both parliament and court, transforming the mafia from a cluster of feuding clans into a national syndicate. This innovation alone secured Luciano's place in criminal history. But he did more. Luciano redefined loyalty itself. Where old bosses demanded submission, he demanded efficiency. Where they relied on fear, he relied on incentive. Luciano treated loyalty as a practical exchange. Trust earned through profit, stability, and opportunity. A man did not owe loyalty because of blood. He owed it because the system benefited him. This shift created a more reliable, predictable organization. It also made the mafia accessible to outsiders. Luciano forged multicultural alliances that shocked conservative Sicilian bosses. Meyer Lansky brought financial brilliance, Bugsy Siegel brought ambition and muscle, Jewish and Irish gangs brought networks the Italians lacked. Luciano saw value where others saw impurity. To him, power did not come from ethnic purity but from collaboration. These partnerships expanded criminal influence nationally, into Las Vegas, Cuba, Florida, and beyond. This multicultural model became the future of organized crime. The mafia learned to work with whoever offered advantage, whether Italian or not. This adaptation allowed the underworld to grow in scale and sophistication, reaching into unions, casinos, ports, and international smuggling. But Luciano's greatest contributions also carried the seeds of his downfall. He believed that structure could contain ambition. He believed that incentives could prevent betrayal. He believed dangerous men could be governed if given roles and rules. Yet those same dangerous men used his system to rise against him. Vito Genovese, who once pretended to be Luciano's ally, manipulated the Commission, reshaped alliances, and eventually forced Luciano out of leadership entirely. The machine Luciano built to prevent tyrants had empowered a new tyrant. The loyalty he engineered proved strong in times of profit but fragile under pressure. And the alliances he created, built on practicality rather than emotional devotion, shifted easily when circumstances changed. This irony defines Luciano's legacy. He built a system to control monsters, yet those monsters inherited the system. He created a loyalty code meant to protect him, yet that code failed when he needed it most. He unified the mafia, yet unity made it easier for rivals to depose him. Still, the impact of his innovations cannot be overstated. Long after Luciano lost power, the Commission continued to govern national operations. Even as new bosses emerged, even as law enforcement scrutiny increased, the mafia operated within the structure he created. His rules guided succession. His alliances enabled expansion. His philosophy shaped decision-making from New York to Chicago to Havana. Even the FBI's understanding of organized crime was influenced by him. The Bureau's investigative strategies, organizational charts, hierarchy mapping, interfamily relationship analysis, were shaped by the structured world Luciano built. To prosecute the mafia, law enforcement first had to understand the system Luciano designed. Yet Luciano's legacy is not defined solely by strategy and structure. It is also defined by myth. Over time, he became a symbol of the modern gangster. Intelligent, diplomatic, visionary. Younger criminals studied him not as a cautionary tale but as a model. His rise represented possibility, his fall represented inevitability. And though he died far from New York, the underworld never forgot the man who brought order to chaos. His name remained spoken in meetings, referenced in disputes, honored in stories. He was remembered as the Don who ended wars, who opened the mafia to new partnerships, who turned loyalty from a vow into a system. His presence lingered like a shadow long after his voice went silent. Yet the deepest element of his legacy lies in the contradiction he never escaped. Luciano mastered loyalty, but never controlled it completely. His brilliance built a network that reshaped crime, but that same network enabled his enemies. His alliances elevated him but also doomed him. The system he created outlived him but refused to belong to him forever. Lucky Luciano did not simply build the modern mafia, he built a legacy defined by the very forces that once empowered him and eventually replaced him. A legacy where loyalty lived longer than the man who imagined it.